So in this video, we're going to have a look at political participation in the UK. Okay. Now I'm going to have a look at the various different forms in which people can participate in their politics. So the first one is probably the most significant, and that is electoral participation. And those who are eligible and registered to vote are known as the electorate. And the Representation of the People Act of 1969 allowed anyone, virtually anyone over the age of 18 to vote. Now, there are different people that can't vote who are over the age of 18, people like prisoners, illegal aliens, and a few other smaller groups of people. However, virtually, if we take a percentage of the UK population over 18, virtually all of them are allowed to vote. Okay, a very small percentage aren't. And this number of people who are able to vote has increased dramatically in recent years, okay? Because in 1831, only around 5% of the adult population were eligible to vote, and they were the upper class men who were engaging in politics already. Everyone else, 95% of the population who were adult, who were registered to vote now, who are eligible to vote now, couldn't vote back in 1831. However, 1969, the Representation of the People Act definitely increased significantly the amount of people that were eligible to vote. So that's now 99%. In the UK, voters are legally required to register to vote before they do their voting. Okay, so you're not legally required to register to vote if you don't want to vote. However, if you want to have a say in politics in the general election, for example, you have to register to vote, and registration is around 85 to 90%. Okay, and there are also a number of elections that are available to you. There's not just general elections. Okay, you can have. We start with general elections because they're the most significant. They're the ones that most people turn out to go and vote for. You've also got elections to the European Parliament. At time of recording, we are still in the EU, despite the fact that there's a number of debates going around about Brexit. As of right now, we're still in the EU, so European Parliament elections are still important. There are also elections to the Scottish, Welsh and Northern Ireland assemblies, so the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh and Northern Ireland Assembly. There's a little asterisk next to that because specifically the electorate within those areas are the only ones that are allowed to vote in those elections. So we'll talk about that in a minute. There's also the London Assembly. There's also the London Mayor elections. There's also local elections. Okay, so the ones with the asterisks, they're the ones where the people that are allowed to vote are the people that are in that region. So you have to be living in Scotland to be able to vote in the Scottish Parliament. And so therefore there's a little asterisk about whether or not the whole UK is allowed to vote in those elections. Now, the most important way we can probably have a look at electoral participation is by looking at the turnout. How many people came out to vote, to cast their ballot, to even put the effort in to go and vote, okay? So turnout is the percentage of registered voters who cast their ballot in a given election. It is essentially how many people decided to vote in the election, is effectively what I just said. So it has a large influence on political participation and has some interesting statistics. So if we look at 3 elections here, so we've got general elections, European Parliament elections and local elections, you can see that the turnout is very different for each one. Okay, this is an interesting thing to look at. So at general elections, we seem to have a turnout of between 60 and 70%, okay? There's a couple that go above and beyond that, but mainly you're in your low 60s. And then recently, in 2010, 2015 and 2017, we've seen a slight increase in turnout, okay? There might have been a political issue that has allowed for more people to take an interest in politics. I'm not sure. Anyway, so the next type of elections are European Parliament elections, and these are significantly lower, almost half the turnout. And these are people that are voting at a percentage of around 36, 38, between 20 and 30%. Between 30 and 40%. Okay, so 1999 being the lowest turnout at 24%, which is significantly low. Okay, and there was only a slight increase in turnout in 2019. With 37%, effectively 37% turnout, okay? And now that's also interesting because we can talk a little bit about Brexit within that context. And then finally, English local elections, we have very low as well, between 30 and 40%. So the highest being in 2006, 36.5%. But there's not really a trend there. There's not really a trend in terms of turnout. The trends we can find with general elections are quite interesting because although we have seen, following 2001, an increase in turnout all the way up to 2017, it's still significantly lower than in other countries, okay? And also in 2019, the European Parliament elections were technically not supposed to happen because we were set to leave the EU on March the 31st. And that didn't actually come to fruition, so therefore we had to take part in the May European Parliament elections. Therefore, the votes that were cast in the European Parliament are interesting because they effectively were votes on Brexit. They were votes on whether or not we stay. People want to stay or leave the European Union, because our influence in the European Parliament will end as soon as Brexit is done, which is set to be around the end of October time. Okay, so the voters really was just seen as a vote on Brexit, which is why we can see a slight turnout increase, because this is when the sort of political environment began to get more and more divisive. So what are the factors that account for the turnout in the different elections? So the type of election is one of them. Voters are more likely to turn out in elections which they value. Okay, if you were a very hardline Brexiteer Leave voter, it was probably not in your best interest to take the time out to go and vote in the European Parliament elections, seeing as you don't want to be part of the European Union anymore. Or, on the flip side, if you are someone that wants to show their support for either Remain or Leave within the European Parliament elections, they could cast their ballot for a party that advocates one or the other, as a way of protesting, as a way of showing Westminster what the people really want and what the kind of influence people have. Okay. There's also the idea of political apathy. So some people believe that elections do little for the political process and are therefore less motivated to vote. If you're living in a constituency that's very, very heavily Labour, for example, and you're a Conservative voter, then you might find yourself apathetic to vote because your vote won't really make a difference, seeing as the person that you're going to elect from your constituency will always be Labour, for example. So that's quite an interesting take on it. So some votes are also less valuable than others. For example, if you, like I said, you live in a constituency with a safe seat, your vote doesn't mean as much. So on the political apathy side, you can say people were apathetic to vote because they didn't see anyone beating the person that they didn't want in, for example, in a safe seat situation. However, on the flip side of that, if you're from a constituency that heavily votes for Labour and you also vote for Labour, then your vote hasn't got the same value as somebody else's vote, because whether or not you vote or not, it seems to be the case that the Labour MP will still get elected, for example. So it is quite interesting that every single person's vote has different values weighted relative to everyone else's. So that's quite an interesting thing to look at. There's also media coverage of an election. Media has a huge influence on not only who votes for who, but also whether or not people even know that a vote is happening. Okay, so the media coverage for local elections, for example, are a lot lower than the media coverage for the bigger general elections. Therefore, we see a slight difference in turnout. But there are also other ways of participating within politics, okay? And there are effectively no limit to the different ways in which one can participate within politics. So one is canvassing. This is just where your local party activists go from door to door in an effort to sway floating voters. So people who don't really know who they want to vote for, if you have a party advocate go in and explain their policies, then they're probably more likely to vote for them. Okay. You've also got the organisation of election events just in general. So most election campaigns are funded locally, although political parties and referendums acts gives parties a £30,000 per constituency spending limit on candidates. It's generally up to local activists to raise the funds needed. So it is very interesting. The Political Parties, Elections and Referendums Act does really set a lot of limits on the spending, because the party that spends the most money, just like in the last video on referendums, the campaign that spends the most money tends to have a greater chance of winning the election. So the Political Parties, Elections and Referendums Act just put a little cap on that to make it a little bit more fair. So there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of other ways in which one can participate in politics. Me making this video and you watching this video is, if anything, a form of political participation. So it's really difficult to judge and to really properly understand political participation in the UK, because effectively there are thousands and thousands of ways in which people can participate within politics. So therefore, looking at the electoral problems, the turnout rate, for example, is quite a good way of really gauging the statistics behind it. Because if we just take into account all kinds of non-electoral participation, then we get very, very lost very, very quickly.